April 12, 1861. 4:30 in the morning. Charleston Harbor lies silent beneath a sky threatening rain. Then the first shell arcs across the darkness. It traces a line of fire from Fort Johnson to Fort Sumter, and when it explodes against the brick walls, it announces the beginning of something that will consume 750,000 lives before it ends. The sound echoes across the water, across the South, across a nation about to tear itself apart. But this story doesn't begin with that shell. It begins years earlier, in places where no cameras ever pointed, in moments history tried to forget. It begins in cotton fields where the sun burns like judgment, in auction blocks where families are divided by the mathematics of profit, in the quarters where people who were told they were property whispered dreams of freedom into the night. It begins with people whose names were often unrecorded, whose stories were written in scars instead of ink, whose humanity was denied by law but never extinguished by chains. By 1860, nearly 4 million people lived in bondage in the United States. 4 million human beings whose labor built fortunes, whose children were assets on ledgers, whose bodies could be bought and sold like livestock. The economy of the South rested on their backs. The wealth of plantation owners flowed from their hands. And when politicians spoke of states' rights and Southern independence, they were speaking in coded language about the right to own other human beings. The enslaved knew this truth with a clarity their masters would never admit. In Virginia, a woman named Mary Lumpkin lived in what her owner called a residence, but what was really a jail. Robert Lumpkin's slave jail in Richmond was one of the most notorious holding pens in the South, a place where enslaved people waited to be sold further south, deeper into the Cotton Kingdom, where mortality rates climbed and hope diminished. Mary had been enslaved by Robert Lumpkin since childhood. She had borne him children born into slavery despite their father's wealth, because the law followed the condition of the mother. She understood the peculiar American mathematics of slavery, that your own children could be property, that love offered no protection, that the person who held power over your life might share your bed, but would never share your freedom. When war came, Mary Lumpkin made a choice that countless enslaved people would make in the years that followed. She waited, she watched, she prepared, because she understood something the Confederacy did not, that this war, whatever the politicians claimed it was about, would become a war about slavery, about freedom, about whether the United States would continue to be a nation where human beings could be owned. The free black population of the North, roughly 500,000 people in 1860, understood this immediately. Men like Frederick Douglass, who had escaped slavery and become one of the most powerful voices for abolition, saw the war for what it was from the first shot. "This is a war for slavery," Douglass declared in his newspaper. "It is a war to make slavery perpetual and universal in this nation." But the Union, at least at first, disagreed. President Abraham Lincoln's administration insisted that the war was about preserving the Union, not about slavery. The border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, remained in the Union while still permitting slavery, and Lincoln feared that any move against slavery would push them into the Confederacy. The policy of the Union Army in those early months was clear: return escaped enslaved people to their masters, even if those masters were in rebellion against the United States. The enslaved population of the South had other ideas. In May 1861, just weeks after Fort Sumter, 3 men arrived at Fort Monroe in Virginia. Frank Baker, Shepard Mallory, and James Townsend had been working on Confederate fortifications when they made their decision. They stole a boat. They rowed across Hampton Roads in darkness. They presented themselves to Union forces and requested asylum. The commander at Fort Monroe was Major General Benjamin Butler, a politician turned soldier from Massachusetts with no particular love for abolition, but a sharp legal mind. When a Confederate officer arrived under a flag of truce to demand the return of his property under the Fugitive Slave Act, Butler made a calculation that would change the war. He declared the 3 men contraband of war. If the Confederacy insisted it was a sovereign nation at war with the United States, Butler reasoned, then enslaved people used to support the Confederate war effort were enemy resources that could be seized. The 3 men would not be returned. They would be employed by the Union and protected within Union lines. Word spread like wildfire through the enslaved community. By July, over 900 people had arrived at Fort Monroe seeking the protection of Butler's contraband policy. They came in families. They came alone. They came with children in their arms and elderly parents supported between them. They came with nothing but the clothes they wore and the courage it took to step into the unknown. They called it stealing themselves. Sarah Brim was 17 when she walked away from a plantation in James City County, Virginia. Years later, she would recall the moment. We heard the Union soldiers was at Fort Monroe, that they weren't sending people back. My mama said, "We goin'," just like that, "We goin'." We left at night, walked 20 miles. I carried my little brother on my back most of the way. When we got to the fort, soldiers stopped us. Mama told them, "We're contraband now. We belong to freedom." The Confederacy built its nation on a foundation of explicit white supremacy. The Confederate Constitution enshrined slavery. Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens declared in March 1861 that the Confederacy's cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This was not a secret. This was not an interpretation. This was Confederate policy stated clearly, defended openly. But the Union's position remained conflicted. Many Union soldiers, particularly from border states, had no interest in fighting for black freedom. Some were virulently racist themselves, opposed to slavery only because it gave unfair economic advantage to plantation owners, not because they believed in racial equality. Others were conflicted, raised in a nation where white supremacy was the accepted norm, now confronted with the reality of enslaved people risking everything for freedom. Lieutenant Charles Brewster of the 10th Massachusetts wrote to his mother in December 1861, "I came here to fight for the restoration of the Union. I did not come here to fight for the Negro, and I do not intend to. But I tell you, when I see these people, when I see what they endure, when I see mothers with children fleeing to our lines with nothing but the rags on their backs, I begin to think perhaps this war is about more than I understood." The transformation was slow, painful, incomplete, but it was inexorable. In August 1861, Congress passed the first Confiscation Act, authorizing the seizure of property, including enslaved people, used to support the rebellion. In April 1862, Congress abolished slavery in Washington, D.C., compensating owners for their loss. In June 1862, slavery was prohibited in all federal territories. Each step was tentative, qualified, incomplete. But each step moved toward a truth that enslaved people had known all along. This war could not end without addressing the institution that had caused it. On September 17, 1862, near Sharpsburg, Maryland, along Antietam Creek, the war reached a turning point. The Battle of Antietam would become the bloodiest single day in American history. 22,717 casualties in 12 hours of fighting. Men from Maine and Georgia, from New York and Alabama, from Ohio and Texas, killing each other across cornfields and sunken roads and stone bridges. The wounded filled every building in Sharpsburg. The dead were buried in mass graves, row after row after row. The battle was tactically inconclusive, but strategically decisive. General Robert E. Lee's first invasion of the North was turned back. The Confederate hope of European recognition was dealt a severe blow. And President Lincoln, who had been carrying a draft of a revolutionary document for months, waiting for a Union victory to give it legitimacy, finally had his moment. On September 22, 1862, 5 days after Antietam, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that as of January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in states still in rebellion against the United States would be forever free. The proclamation was a war measure, not a humanitarian gesture. It explicitly exempted border states and areas already under Union control. It freed no one immediately. The Confederate states naturally ignored it, but it fundamentally transformed the nature of the war. Now, officially, the Union was fighting not just to preserve the nation, but to end slavery. Enslaved people throughout the South understood the implications immediately. The Confederacy mobilized to prevent word of the proclamation from spreading. Plantation owners hid newspapers, patrollers increased surveillance, punishments for insolence became more severe. But information traveled through the enslaved community along channels that white Southerners could never fully control. Whispered conversations in quarters, messages carried by trusted intermediaries, signs and signals invisible to masters. Charlotte Fortin, a free black woman from Philadelphia, who traveled to the South Carolina Sea Islands to teach formerly enslaved people, recorded in her diary on January 1, 1863, "The most glorious day this nation has yet seen. The President's proclamation takes effect today. The people here, these people who have waited so long, who have suffered so much, are wild with joy. They sing, they pray, they cry. We are free, they say. We are free at last." But freedom, as they would discover, came with a terrible price. In Louisiana, in 1863, a plantation owner named Jim Finley responded to the Emancipation Proclamation by gathering the people he enslaved and telling them they were free to leave. Then he and his sons opened fire with shotguns, killing dozens of men, women, and children attempting to flee. Similar massacres occurred across the South, often unreported, unpunished, forgotten. The war created a massive refugee crisis. Hundreds of thousands of formerly enslaved people fled to Union lines, creating what they called contraband camps, chaotic, overcrowded, disease-ridden settlements where freedom meant starvation rations, inadequate shelter, and minimal medical care. The Union Army, unprepared for this humanitarian catastrophe, struggled to provide even basic necessities. In Tennessee, at Camp Holly Springs, thousands of refugees lived in tents and lean-tos through the winter of 1862-1863. A smallpox epidemic killed hundreds. Pneumonia and dysentery killed hundreds more. Union chaplain John Eaton, assigned to manage contraband camps, wrote in despair, They are dying by the score daily. We have not the supplies to care for them. They are free, but they are dying free. Yet still they came, because slavery was worse, because freedom, even with its hardships, was worth any price, because they understood something that many in the North still struggled to grasp, that their fate and the fate of the nation were inseparable, that there could be no restored union built on the foundation of human bondage, that this war would decide whether America's founding promise of liberty was meaningful or merely ornamental. In January 1863, Lincoln authorized the recruitment of black soldiers into the United States Army. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Frederick Douglass toured the North recruiting. Men of color, to arms! This is our war. This is our moment. The opportunity has come to strike for freedom and for country. By the end of the war, nearly 180,000 black men would serve in the United States colored troops. Another 19,000 would serve in the Navy. They represented roughly 10% of the Union military. They fought in 449 engagements, including 39 major battles. 16 would receive the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. They were paid less than white soldiers. They received inferior equipment. They were often assigned to labor details rather than combat. And they faced a threat that white Union soldiers did not. The Confederacy refused to treat captured black soldiers as prisoners of war. Instead, they were often executed, re-enslaved, or sent to labor camps where mortality rates approached 100%. On April 12, 1864, Confederate forces under Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest attacked Fort Pillow in Tennessee, a garrison held by 295 black soldiers and 285 white soldiers. When the fort fell, what followed was not a battle, but a massacre. Confederate soldiers killed wounded black troops in their beds. They shot men attempting to surrender. They burned buildings with wounded within. Estimates of Union casualties range from 277 to over 350, with black soldiers bearing the brunt of the slaughter. A Confederate soldier, Sergeant Achilles Clark, wrote to his sisters, "The poor deluded Negroes would run up to our men, fall upon their knees, and with uplifted hands scream for mercy, but they were ordered to their feet and then shot down. I, with several others, tried to stop the butchery, but General Forrest ordered them shot down like dogs." Nathan Bedford Forrest would later become the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. The Fort Pillow massacre sent shockwaves through black regiments. Some called for revenge. Others steeled themselves for the reality they faced, that they were fighting not one war, but two, one against the Confederacy and one against the racism embedded in their own army and nation. Sergeant William Kearny of the 54th Massachusetts, a regiment of free black men from the North, distinguished himself at the Battle of Fort Wagner in South Carolina on July 18, 1863. When the color-bearer was shot, he seized the American flag and carried it forward through murderous fire. Wounded in the head, chest, and legs, he refused to let the flag touch the ground, declaring, "Boys, the old flag never touched the ground." He would become the first black recipient of the Medal of Honor, though the award would not be presented until 1900, 37 years after his act of valor. The 54th Massachusetts suffered 272 casualties out of 600 men in the assault on Fort Wagner. The battle was a tactical defeat, but it was a strategic victory for the cause of black military service, demonstrating that black soldiers would fight and die with the same courage as any others.
In the South, the enslaved population became a destabilizing force that the Confederacy could not counter. enslaved people passed intelligence to Union forces, sabotaged Confederate equipment, and fled in massive numbers that crippled the plantation economy. The Confederacy's entire agricultural system, dependent on enslaved labor, began to collapse as the very people it depended on chose freedom. Mary Lumpkin, who had waited in Richmond through 3 years of war, made her move as Union forces approached the city in April 1865. She helped Union prisoners escape from her enslavers' jail. She provided intelligence on Confederate troop movements. When Richmond fell and Robert Lumpkin fled, Mary took control of his property, the jail where she had been enslaved, where her children had been born into bondage. She would live there for the rest of her life, transforming it into a school for black children. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Other Confederate armies would surrender in the following weeks. The war was over. The cost was almost incomprehensible. 620,000 to 750,000 dead, depending on the historical estimate. More American casualties than all other American wars combined, from the Revolution through Vietnam. Entire towns decimated, whole generations of young men gone. The South was physically destroyed, its economy shattered, its infrastructure in ruins. But the human cost went beyond the battlefield dead. The war created approximately 200,000 widows in the North alone. Enslaved widows and orphans numbered in the tens of thousands. The psychological trauma, what would later be called PTSD, affected hundreds of thousands of veterans. Wounded survivors, missing limbs, blinded, permanently disabled, numbered in the hundreds of thousands on both sides. And then there were the formerly enslaved. 4 million people suddenly freed into a nation that had not prepared for their freedom, that in many cases did not want their freedom, that would spend the next century and a half struggling with the implications of that freedom. December 6, 1865. The 13th Amendment was ratified. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Slavery was abolished, not just in the rebellious states, but everywhere in the United States. The amendment that enslaved people had fought for, died for, fled toward through darkness and danger, was now the law of the land. But freedom, as they were about to discover, was not the same as equality. The period of Reconstruction, the 12 years following the war, would see extraordinary progress and devastating backlash. Black men gained the right to vote. Black politicians were elected to local, state, and federal offices. Public schools were established for black children. Economic opportunities, however limited, began to emerge. But this progress was met with violent resistance. The Ku Klux Klan and similar terrorist organizations murdered, lynched, and intimidated black citizens and their white allies. The federal government's commitment to protecting black rights wavered and eventually collapsed. By 1877, when the last federal troops were withdrawn from the South, the brief window of Reconstruction was closing. What followed was Jim Crow, a system of legal segregation, disenfranchisement, and economic oppression that would last nearly a century. Lynching became a tool of racial terror, with thousands of black Americans murdered by white mobs between 1877 and the 1950s. Sharecropping replaced slavery as a system of economic exploitation, keeping black families in perpetual debt and poverty. The Civil War had ended slavery, but it had not ended racism. It had not ended white supremacy. It had not created the equal society that so many had fought and died for. Sarah Brim, who had walked to freedom at Fort Monroe in 1861, lived to see her grandchildren denied the right to vote by poll taxes and literacy tests. She lived to see segregation laws that prohibited her family from using the same water fountains, the same schools, the same public facilities as white citizens. She lived to see lynchings go unpunished and justice denied. When interviewed by the Works Progress Administration in 1937, at age 93, she said, "We thought freedom meant we'd be equal. We thought it meant we'd have the same chances. We were young. We were hopeful. We were wrong. But I don't regret walking away that night. I don't regret risking everything for freedom, because even though we didn't get all we hoped for, we got something. We got ourselves. We got our children. We got the right to try. And someday, not necessarily in my lifetime, but someday, maybe America will live up to what it promised." She died in 1938. The Civil War did not end racism, but it ended the legal institution of human slavery. It established in the Constitution that all people born in the United States were citizens. It affirmed, at terrible cost, that the United States would remain one nation, not two. And it just began, the long, unfinished journey toward the equality promised in the Declaration of Independence. Sergeant William Carney, who carried the flag at Fort Wagner, lived until 1908. He worked as a postal employee in New Bedford, Massachusetts. He gave speeches to veterans groups and schools. He told young people, "Freedom is not free. It is purchased with blood and courage. My generation paid that price. Yours must defend it." Mary Lumpkin died in 1905. The school she established in Robert Lumpkin's former slave jail continued operating until the 1870s, educating hundreds of formerly enslaved children. The building still stands in Richmond, Virginia, a reminder that transformation is possible, that places of suffering can become places of learning, that people who were told they were property could reclaim their humanity and their history. Frederick Douglass spent the rest of his life fighting for civil rights, women's suffrage, and justice. He died in 1895, having seen slavery abolished, but knowing that the work was far from complete. He once said, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters."
The Civil War was America's thunder and lightning. Its awful roar echoes still. 750,000 dead. 4 million enslaved people freed, a nation torn apart and stitched back together with imperfect, insufficient thread. The war answered one fundamental question. Slavery would not continue in the United States. But it left countless questions unanswered. What would freedom mean? What would equality look like? How would a nation built on white supremacy transform into a multiracial democracy? These questions are not historical curiosities. They remain urgent in the 21st century. The Civil War ended in 1865, but its causes, its consequences, its unresolved tensions continue to shape American life. The fight for racial justice that began before the first shot at Fort Sumter continues today in different forms, with different tactics, but the same essential struggle for the recognition of human dignity, for equal protection under law, for the promise that all people are created equal to be more than words on paper. In 1862, Lincoln wrote to Congress, "We cannot escape history. We of this Congress and this administration will be remembered in spite of ourselves. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation." That fiery trial was the Civil War. Its light still illuminates the American landscape, revealing both how far the nation has come and how far it has yet to go. The people who fought in that war, black and white, Union and Confederate, soldiers and civilians, enslaved and free, deserve to be remembered, not as abstract historical figures, but as human beings who faced impossible choices, who suffered and sacrificed, who showed courage and cowardice, who lived and died in a moment when the nation's fundamental character was being decided. They deserve to be remembered accurately, honestly, without romanticism or revisionism. The Confederacy fought to preserve slavery. The Union fought, eventually, to end it. These are not matters of interpretation. They are matters of historical record, stated clearly by the people who fought the war, embedded in the documents they left behind. To honor the dead of the Civil War is not to glorify war, but to remember its cost. To honor those who fought for freedom is not to claim that freedom was achieved, but to acknowledge how much was sacrificed in its pursuit. To study this war is to understand that the work of building a just society is never finished, that each generation inherits both the progress and the failures of those who came before, that history is not past, but present, not concluded, but ongoing. The Civil War was America's bloodiest conflict. It was also America's second founding, the moment that the nation chose, at immeasurable cost, to begin the work of living up to its founding ideals. That work continues. The people who fought and died in that war, who walked to freedom through darkness, who carried the flag under fire, who challenged their nation to be better than it was, they light the way forward. Their struggle is not over. Their sacrifice must not be forgotten. Their story is America's story, tragic, inspiring, unfinished. If this story moved you, if it made you understand the cost of freedom and the price of justice, subscribe and help us keep this history alive, because those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it, and those who remember the past have the power to shape the future.